introduce Eric with Defenders Hate It, Compromise Vulnerable SaaS Applications with This One Weird Trick. Everyone, welcome Eric, please.
Thank you. All right. So, yeah, we'll just get into the things here. Have a lot to cover. Depending on how much time we have left at the end, maybe we'll sort of see video of this actually being done in the wild here. But again, introduction. So I'm Eric Woodruff. I'm currently Chief Identity Architect at Semperis. We do Active Directory, Entra ID security stuff. If you're wondering what that title means, I do as well. Social media handles there, not cool hackery things, but feel free to hit me up about this or anything else. And yeah, we'll just get right into it. So right on the backstory here for what we're going to be talking about today, is NoAuth. Right, and so this was disclosed by Omer Cohen of Dscope on June 20th, 2023. And in their research, they talked about how it was around April 2023 that they reported this to Microsoft. It's a vulnerability, get this out of my way, in apps using OpenID Connect to integrate with Entra ID for authentication. Right, the vulnerability is rooted essentially in an anti-pattern for implementations of OpenID Connect. And it allows an application, or the vulnerable application allows for takeover, impersonation, however you want to put it, of any user in that application, just if you know their email address, right? So if the app is vulnerable to it, I know their email, I can get in as this person. And Dscope at the time basically, classified this as a sort of cross-identity provider attack. So, we'll kind of be hopping back and forth to a timeline here, right? So, so far what we know is June 20th, this was disclosed, and then we have today, right? And sort of like, who cares, right? This is now a 2+-year-old vulnerability. But, I think there's some interesting things going on here, unfortunately, with NoAuth, right? So when this was published, MSRC put out this blog article on risk of privilege escalation in Azure AD applications. Right, and then within this, I thought this was interesting, this customer impact piece of things, and actually I really need reading glasses here. The only slide I'm going to read to folks, but I got to look at this monitor so I can actually see, is Microsoft has identified several multi-tenant apps with users that use an email address with an unverified domain owner. Although unverified email addresses do not pose a risk to applications that don't utilize the claim for authorization purposes, and the underlying part, right, these application owners have been notified and provided with guidance on how to modify their applications if applicable. Right, so the TLDR here is that, Microsoft sort of looked at applications, and if they believed an app was using this email claim, right, they notified, the owner of the app on how to remediate things. Again, underlined, right, if you did not receive a notification, your application has not consumed email claims with unverified domain owners. So again, right, they're basically saying, if we didn't notify you, then you don't need to worry about anything, my interpretation, right? And then they have some, protect customers and applications that may be vulnerable. There's some mitigations in place, and we'll kind of dive into those mitigations a bit down the road here. So, when this came out also, it was interesting because if you looked at a lot of the news that, was out there when Dscope published this, right? So we have the Hacker News here, and then Bleeping Computer, right? So Hacker News, critical NoAuth flaw on Azure AD enabled, right? Sort of past tense, complete account takeover, Bleeping Computer, right? Microsoft fixes Azure AD auth flaw enabling account takeover. Again, Petri, right, Microsoft, patches critical NoAuth flaw on Azure AD apps. So you could go read all this and sort of just presume like, well, hey, right, it was a Microsoft problem, and now Microsoft's done a Microsoft fix, and we can all just sort of move on with our lives. And actually, I completely forgot about this when I was researching that. In 2023, I wrote a blog article that probably very few people read, where I was actually complaining about the reporting on NoAuth, because it wasn't actually, a patch or a fix. Right, so again, our timeline here, what do we know so far, right? So effectively June 2023, that NoAuth was declared, quote, fixed here, right? And I also think what was interesting from, the maybe lack of attention that this drew in the security community is less than a month later, we had the Storm 0558 incident, which if folks are familiar, those that aren't, right? This is where Microsoft signing keys were stolen, and it was this whole big thing, right? Trying to figure out what was compromised, how to happen, and that really overshadowed, I think, a lot of other, security incidents that could have been going on in the Microsoft ecosystem. But again, who cares here, right? This is still 2+ years old. This isn't really anything that's, mind-blowing so far. But unfortunately, right, the thing is that NoAuth is something that still exists today, right? So, we were starting to perform research in NoAuth, and in fact, finding that it is far from dead here. Right, so the descope focus of things was this, and we'll just kind of walk through the flow and where our research sort of differed from theirs. Right, they were basically looking at, these cross-IDP attacks. So a legitimate user, is authenticating with Google. Maybe they're a Google Workspace shop, right? An attacker configures this attack Entra tenant that they use. The attacker authenticates with Entra using that unverified email attribute. And the application effectively has account merge logic flaws in it that doesn't verify email ownership, right? Now the attacker is in, again, with this sort of cross-IDP type attack. And right, to sort of look at this from a different view here, right? If we have some SaaS application and I'm a user here as Eric, at fabricam.com in that application, right? And say, again, I have a Google account and I use that to authenticate to that app, right? Some of these apps you go to and they've got sign in with, Apple and Google and Microsoft and Facebook and et cetera, right? Generally, when you come in and you're coming in with some other account with some other system, we generally have some account merge logic, right? And so what this looks like in real life, and I'm using Adobe here. I don't know if Adobe was ever, vulnerable during the first round of things, but they're not now, just easy examples, right? So the flow that they're looking at, right, is generally when you try these account merge things, I'm signing in with Microsoft for the first time, you go through sort of like an OTP or a magic link process, right, where you have to fill out something to basically verify you actually own that email address. And then, that we usually email you as well saying, hey, just to let you know, we sort of combined these two accounts. Let us know if that's not the case. Right, but effectively their thing was finding where this logic was flawed. By flawed, it was usually just missing, right? So they would just merge accounts and then basically, Mr. or Mrs. Bad Guy could just get into that account. So the research that we were doing, looking at, the work that Dscope did a bit further here, where this looks a bit different is, right, we have a legitimate user authenticating with Entra. The attacker configures, that attack Entra tenant again. The attacker authenticates with Entra with an unverified email attribute. And the application is not following OpenID Connect standards for how authentication should be implemented. And, so effectively we're looking at this as like a cross-tenant type attack. And one thing I wanted to just point out on here is also, right, I think one other thing that sort of was a failure in the original reporting on this, and also how Dscope framed it, right, is by saying it's like, Microsoft accounts taking over Google accounts. Again, developers could think, well, hey, we're only using Microsoft, right? There's a lot of SaaS apps out there that maybe if it's a very Microsoft, centric application, might only use, Entra, right, as their IDP. So again, they look at the news, look at how the research is published, and just sort of like, well, right, we're not using Google, so, who cares? Right, so diving into things a bit further and looking at how this all sort of functions a bit deeper, want to first level set some knowledge here, right? So we're just going to first talk about app registrations and service principles, a common theme, as we saw in the last talk here, right, when we're talking about this sort of stuff. So we have our SaaS application here, right, Contoso SaaS app. And we have that sign in with Microsoft, button that will be on these applications, right? Or sign in with Office 365, whatever you want to call it. Right, so on the developer side, so Contoso, right, they're the software vendor. They have this app registration, Contoso SaaS app. And then in the consuming tenant, right, there's going to be that service principal, right? And effectively, there's a relationship between these two, right? So the app registration is basically like the developer's definition of what they need. And again, right, it can be saying it's a public or confidential client, other things, again, like redirect URIs, and also claims, right? So the developer will essentially say, these are the claims I want, from the identity provider, from Entra, when I'm getting that ID token. right? And then, so our service principal effectively is the security principal in the consuming tenant, and this is the thing that, customer consents to for the application on first use, and effectively enables, right, authentication authorization against that consuming tenant. Right, so going back to our application, right, this is kind of how these things, tie together to that button. And then, right, Microsoft has this sort of common endpoint system, right, that supports across, all Entra tenants, right, multi-tenant authentication, right, which is why attacks like this wouldn't happen against something like Okta or whatnot, right? So we have common endpoints out there that enable multi-tenant apps, right? And again, there's an authorization endpoint and token endpoints that are used for different things, and we're not going to get into that, right? But it's important to point out here that, that common endpoint is a thing that is what really enables this, right? Microsoft has sort of engineered or architected themselves into this corner when we start talking about no-auth. But so if we're following the OpenID Connect spec, here we have, user Eric at fabricam.com at the consuming tenant, right, and goes to the application and hits, sign in with Microsoft, right? And it might be a little hard to see on here, but you don't really need to read all this, right? But we effectively get that ID token from Entra, right? And then our SaaS applications are going to have some, user database, user table on the back end, right? And effectively in that, we're going to capture different attribute data about that user. And the thing is, we want to make sure that we're, looking for subject or issuer, or sometimes maybe, OID here, right? But effectively, these are unique, immutable identifiers, right? The issuer is the tenant ID for the Entra tenant, which is always going to be globally unique. And the subject is a pairwise identifier that's, basically some sort of hash combination of the user's object ID, the application ID, and the tenant ID, right? So you can be sure that if you see this subject coming in an ID token, you always know this is that user. And from an Entra perspective, right, this is immutable. There's no way that you can modify or manipulate the subject claim. Right, so in our no-auth vulnerable applications, right, it's going to look similar from an end user perspective. Here we're basically going and hitting sign with Microsoft. The application still gets that ID token here, right? We still have our, user table on the back end of our SaaS app. But the problem is here, right, that, we're only focused on, basically things that are mutable identifiers, like email address, right? Now a developer might think, well, hey, conceptually, right, email addresses are unique, but not thinking of the fact that potentially an ID token, right, may be coming in with one where that email address is in fact mutable data, right, from the identity provider here. So, right, we can abuse this effectively now because we have, our evil tenant here, and we have our evil user, right, where we can see that my UPN here is eric at evil.cloud, but I can go spoof my email address to eric at fabricam.com, right? I go hit sign in with Microsoft. I send this ID token up to, the SaaS application. Right now, the subject, issuer, all that sort of stuff is going to differ in this. But if my application is only looking at email address, right, I'm effectively in as this end user. Right now, I have access to everything that they have access to. Right, so setting an unverified email address is super simple here, and we'll just walk through a very quick video of this maybe, if I can get off my ink. So right, we can see here that, right, basically here we got a user, Kenny Rogers, and we'll scroll down a little bit here and see the mail address, kenny.rogers at blah, blah, blah on Microsoft.com. And we're just going to run a very simple patch operation here. Right, so we're going to go basically just update the mail address, right? This is using Graph Explorer. There's 100 different ways we can do this. So we patch a user, we don't get an error, and we just, do another get on Kenny, and now we can see that we're, effectively saying that we're Alex Wilbur at Fabricam, right? And we could then go in as Alex Wilbur into whatever application is vulnerable here. So, there's also other methods for setting unverified email address, right? And again, the initial Dscope research was really just looking at that one method that we just looked at, but you can also convert guest invites to members and hybrid users, right? So if it's a hybrid environment with Active Directory, if the mail address is set to something in Active Directory that's not verified, that's going to flow up to, Entra as well. In the reality, right, most attackers would probably go through that first path because it wouldn't make sense to sort of go compromise someone's Active Directory to then use that tenant to, pivot into some other tenant. But just pointing out that there are other ways to sort of set this unverified email address. Right, so also if we want to examine claims, we can easily look at this, right? So kind of trying to understand how this works, a bit easier with Jot.ms, right? So if we go to this diagram and we want to basically, look at that ID token, right? We can actually go out here and configure an app registration and redirect our ID token to Jot.ms. Right now, I was trying to re-record this demo when I was on the road over the weekend. Had some lab difficulties, so apologies if it's a bit small here. Right, so we're going to see here that we're actually signing into our application as our valid user, right? And once we, auth here, work on my video editing skills a little bit. And we can see here that, right, here's Alex Wilbur with Alex's, email claim here, right? But Alex is that user, so there's no issue. But now we're going to go in as, right, the attacker user here, where we've already gone through and, adjusted the email claim in Entra, right? And we're going to this application that would be, quote, effectively, vulnerable to no auth, authenticate. Right, and so again, it might be hard to read, especially in the back, but if we look here, right, this other user, coming in also has Alex's email claim set on the account, right? And so, it's an easy way to sort of see how this, conceptually removing an application would happen. So, if we're talking about, the abuse here, right, Microsoft implemented, as they mentioned, some mitigating controls here, right? So, there is a concept of verified and unverified domains, right? So if you're onboarding an Entra tenant for, consumption purposes, or usually, right, if you're using Microsoft 365, you go through some process where you say, hey, like we want to use this for email, for exchange and all that stuff, right? And you verify your domain name, either with a, text or MX record sort of check here, right? So we can say whether a domain is verified or unverified. Right, in app registrations that have been created after June 2023, right, when this research was published, basically say that the remove unverified email claim, this attribute on the app registration, is true by default, right? So new app registrations inherently wouldn't be vulnerable to this, but, how many applications existed before June 2023, right? A lot of them. But there's also bypasses on this sort of stuff, right? So the developer can set this claim to false, so they can just flip a bit on this and basically say, no, I want to consume unverified email claims, and they might find that they have legitimate purposes to do this. And again, right, applications created before June 2023 and are using that email claim. So, when we're getting into trying to find applications to research for, potential vulnerability to no-auth, we actually were looking at the Entra gallery, and so in the Entra gallery, it's this sort of dumpster that exists for easy integration of applications with Entra ID, and you can come out to this thing and basically just filter by OpenID Connect, right, and basically get all the applications that are multi-tenant, right? But these are the only ones that, ISVs, they ask to get put into this, right? So this is only a fraction of all the applications out there that are multi-tenant, right? Vendors basically have to apply to get put in this gallery here. But in this, right, so we at the time had, 1,017 OpenID Connect applications in here, and we tested 104 of these, right? So basically we were trying to find apps that had some sort of, self-service sign up, sign in sort of stuff going on, trials that didn't require you to basically talk to a salesperson or something like that, right? Because we're just trying to test the water here to see what the landscape of vulnerability looks like for this, right? And this is where we found 9 applications that were vulnerable within here. And you may look at this and say, well, that's like sort of a drop in the bucket, right? But if we look at it a different way here, right, that's 8.6%. So if we're generous and round up to 9, right, out of our testing that were vulnerable. So, in this, one of the things I've been asked a lot is like, well, how many applications, right, do you think are actually vulnerable out there, right? And we don't really know, right? Nobody really can tell how many are vulnerable, right? I'd say it's probably more than 10. I don't think I found, 90% of all applications that were vulnerable to this. Microsoft should, and I believe they do know, right, how many applications are consuming this email claim. But unfortunately, right, the consumption doesn't mean they're vulnerable. Again, app developers could be using that claim because they want to send an email to someone, right? Unfortunately, unless you actually have eyes into the SaaS app, you have no idea what the application is doing with that ID token once it receives it, right? So, with this, though, back to our timeline here. So December 3rd, 2024, opened a case with MSRC on our findings, both because we're like, hey, you have this stuff in the entry gallery. Customers could potentially think that this stuff has been, vetted better than stuff that's not in it. Also, you sort of made it sound like you worked with the developers to fix these problems a couple years ago, right? Kind of what's up with the findings here. And right, as far as the applications that we found, right, so of these 9, there was a human resources platform, right, which was the thing that was really most concerning here. Now, it wasn't like a big Workday level one, but nonetheless, right, it would have been chock full of PII. Again, and the concern is it would take a trivial amount of work to go figure out who the HR administrators are, potentially of customers of their platform, and then pivot in as those users, right, and get access to basically all the employee data in there. There was also a absence management system that I won't have more details on yet because it's still vulnerable, that also had a lot of PII sort of stuff within it. 3 knowledge sharing platforms, collaboration platforms, right, which, inherently you might say, like, so what, but they felt like those sorts of systems, right, that potentially, security teams could keep, architectural diagrams and all this other sort of stuff about environments in. Some other platform out there that, again, is still not resolved that they claim to have 45,000 plus customers. A business coaching platform, and this is where it also gets interesting, that had Office 365 integrations. There's some construction site management platform, and a meeting scheduling platform with O365 integration, right? So think of like a Calendly type thing. And the O365 ones also were a bit concerning because effectively you could use a SaaS application, right, to then go pivot into these people's mail accounts, right? You'd get access to their calendar. Some of them could send mail, read, calendar data, send invites, read email, stuff like that, right? So there's also that concern that the SaaS app now is a new pivot point, right, into their Office 365 environment. And interestingly here, we'll sort of talk about the application vendor response. So December 2nd, right, we started notifying the application vendors basically the day before we opened our case with MSRC. And this is basically what, most app vendors sort of response was like, if we even got one from them. So, right, with the application vendors, the quicks was within 1 week, one resolved the issues. We worked with them pretty closely to get that taken care of. And as you can see, right, again, the longest is still ones that are ongoing, right? 2 weeks before sort of putting this together, testing these applications as we'd occasionally do, found that these 2 were still vulnerable. And interestingly, and sort of taking some digs at vendors here, right, and their sort of lack of concern around this stuff, right, is it was varying in how easy or not easy it was to report these problems, right? So you go to the vendor site, you try to find, their privacy policy or some stuff about all their SOC 2 compliance and all that, and you're like, all right, somewhere there's got to be like a privacy or a security email address or something like that, or you just guess, right, if you don't find anything, or you find their, ticketing system and you open a ticket and you're like, hey, I found this sort of vulnerability. But it was a bit all over the place. Some we resulted to go into like LinkedIn and trying to see who, their CISO or their data protection officer or whatnot was. And also, right, variation in the vendor response. So with the MSRC case, Microsoft also started contacting some of these vendors. And while I won't really speak on their behalf, it seems like some basically could care less that you're trying to, warn them of a problem, right? And initially, because you're not sure who you should talk to, right? We didn't want to disclose all the details of some sort of random email address, but as you're going through, right, you sort of are more specific, like, hey, like, here's this problem, right? And you sort of get no response, or we'll look at it, right? And I don't know how many months it takes to look at something like this, but the other thing that is a bit interesting is, some just actually removed their integration, so I'm assuming they just like couldn't figure out the problem and it wasn't worth it to them. And some actually put up paywalls that prohibited testing. So Again, just an interesting sort of thing here where when we went to go retest a few of these sometime around April, May, a couple of them now that were sort of like, free trials basically required you to put in a credit card or something like that, or, contact their sales department. And again, it made me wonder, did they actually fix the issue, or are they just putting up some other way to prevent you from actually testing this thing? And also the case I had with MSRC, and here it's grudge time with Microsoft. So basically, right, this is what the case was like when I was working with them, or I guess not working with them so much. Right, so the MSRC case, as mentioned, right, December 3rd, opened this case with MSRC. December 4th, right, the day later, this case was acknowledged by MSRC. Again, we had that one organization that was pretty quick to update things, so we wanted Microsoft to know, like, hey, this one we reported that's vulnerable is no longer vulnerable, in case they were also reaching out to the vendors. So sometime in December I was awarded 60 points, and I'm like, okay, cool. Like, generally, if you're in the Microsoft research world, if you get points, that must mean like they care about the problem, right? So I'm like, well, that's good, right? And it seems like it's moving along or whatnot. And then the silence starts. So eventually, March 17th, right? So giving them enough time, they're off doing their 0-day quest or whatever it was, fun stuff, right? Ask them about actual cases that are open and what the status is. And also, March 18th, now I tried color coding this and now realized I made a mistake because the red was supposed to be me reaching out to them. So March 18th, I also notified them that I was going to be speaking about this sort of stuff, right? And then interestingly, a day later, I lose my points. So I'm like, okay, well, they obviously are paying attention to me, right? Because I lost them pretty quick, but I haven't received any response back. And so I asked them about the point loss, right? I'm like, hey, again, just like trying to figure out what's going on. And, I'd say in particular, right, because this was a thing that I thought was complex because this is an already disclosed vulnerability, but we feel like we have strong enough findings to open a case. We're not looking to necessarily, right, go sort of dump on Microsoft here without talking to them first, right? So it was a very frustrating process because we're trying to work the system the way they want, right? And they're just sort of silent here. And then a month later, they closed the case with these sort of like, some sort of problem has been, the problem you report is fixed. We'll put you on like the wall thanking you, right? So in the whole thing here, no response at all from them actually with any details of, what they thought, any of my questions, none of it was answered. So then the end of April, after I started being less frustrated with them, I contacted MSRC Listens, which they started to engage with me on, but still even this, right, I have not heard anything, recently. But where it got a little interesting was, because I also was speaking at Troopers about this last week, that as we're getting closer to disclosure time, all of a sudden you start to get that like, oh, like maybe they're thinking this isn't going to look so great, right? So at the end of June, June 20th, so the Friday before, losing track of time with the travel, right? Very recent, right? Had some conversations with MSRC, but unfortunately, right, this still was not through the official channels here, right? So again, there's still some frustration with the case. But some of the information that, we've talked about in here was sort of like things that I was allowed to, talk about, right? And one thing that we have in the blog, which I'll have up in a minute here, was basically MSRC said that the applications that aren't resolving themselves, right, or if people find others that they will kick out of the gallery. Unfortunately, right, that doesn't actually fix anything, but. And I mean, this is basically what it feels like, though, working with them, right? Because their blog back in 2023 was, saying it's a developer problem, LOL, like, have fun. And I think that they could still do more to protect customers here, right? And this is where we sort of talk about defense and mitigation. And when we're talking about UnOauth and why I think it needs to be taken more seriously, so I actually took this during Matt's session this morning, right, is, he has this bullet point up that you can't detect what you don't see. And this is very, very difficult to observe this happening out in the wild, right? And so if we're talking about mitigation and defense from the customer side of things, right, so again, if we're looking at the consuming tenant, right, where we have our conditional access and we have our authentication and MFA requirements, and we're like, you got to do passkeys and all this great stuff, and we've got Defender for Cloud Apps and our CASBs and all that, right? That's all in that tenant. So out in our evil tenant, where auth and everything is effectively out of band, right? This is all just bypassing all those defenses that, right, the consuming organization is going to, expect or hope or think is going to protect them here. Right, and again, even it just sort of was thinking a bit further on this, right, if we're looking at that SaaS application, right, and thinking of, SSPMs, right, SaaS Security Posture Management solutions, right, these things are really just looking at all the knobs and dials on SaaS applications, right, and I'm not deeply familiar with them, but generally, right, they're not going to be something that's going to be picking up on this type of vulnerability, right, so it's taking them sort of out of the equation. And similar, right, like Push Security and other companies love like what they're doing with browser extension stuff, right? But it's really not something that's going to pick up on NoAuth, right? So that sort of stuff is also taken out of the loop here from trying to detect, the problem from a more traditional defense perspective. Right, and then, kind of other just brainstorming on detection here, right? So what are you sort of left with? And that's basically, log correlation, right? So if we have our SaaS application and we have our Entra ID sign-in logs, right, we could do something where, this is, conceptual, right, where we're basically comparing our Entra sign-in data to, the application sign-in data, right, and looking for some sort of blank thing here where there's a sign-in in the SaaS app, but not an Entra, right, but nobody's doing this for real, right? Even if your SaaS application at first supports any way to export or even gather, robust sign-in log information, right? No one's sending this to their Splunk or their Sentinel. And I actually thought, Matt's talk earlier this morning was also very interesting on, right, the complexities of actually trying to do this, right? So for the most part, this is a futile effort for SaaS applications to really expect this to be a way to, right, determine if something's going on, right? So to me, right, the customer is basically just completely left in the dark. Now, again, in the case we opened with Microsoft, right, we basically asked them, hey, can you put some sort of attribute data on the service principal so that, an organization will know if the app is consuming an unverified email address. Now, again, right, I get that won't ultimately tell you if the application is vulnerable, but it will at least give the app or the customer, right, who's sort of stuck in the middle between Microsoft, who's saying, LOL, developer problem, and the developer having no idea, that they have a problem, right? The customer might have some awareness to potentially have conversations with the developer, ask what the mail claim is being used for, and so on. Right, and so for the vendor, the developer, right, the mitigation really is, to fix your application, right? So checking the app reg for remove unverified email claims, seeing if this is set to true, or if your application, right, is older than June 2023. I'm going to really test your application. So the one organization that we were working with that was really good about wanting to resolve this, they implemented some changes in their app, right, where they thought they were following things according to OpenID spec, but they asked us to go basically test their application again, and we found it was still vulnerable. So, right, we had a few iterations of them doing things where they noticed that they did something in one region but not the other, right, for how their app was built. So really important to test your app, right, test your application, for this, fix it, test it, and you could just keep going on, right? I cannot stress it enough because ultimately, it is the only way to protect your application from NoAuth is to make sure that you're not using mail claim for, that user identifier. So right, if we're going into Graph Explorer, we can again just basically pull up this authentication behaviors on an app registration. And when we look at authentication behaviors, we can look for this remove unverified email claim, right? And so if this is set to false, this basically means that the application is consuming, right, an unverified domain mail claim. And again, we can go run a patch on this, right? If say, hey, we check our app and we know we're not using this, so we can just get rid of it, right, and run a patch, and we should just, then go basically do another get and, get this back and see that it's true. And one thing I just want to highlight, though, is if you're trying to go sort of trawl applications, right, to see what ones might have this set, right, if you're like a software vendor or you publish software, Microsoft said in their documentation that after June 2023 that this was set to false by default. But actually finding it's like a back-end behavior thing. So applications created after June 2023 for authentication behaviors will just get no data back, right, if it's false. So you won't actually find that attribute set. It will just be empty, and you'll just have to go look at the date basically on the app registration. Right, but like I mentioned earlier, there are reasons to consume an unverified email claim, right? Again, an application might just want to send the email, right, to people, right? So it's not inherently, wrong thing to want the email address for users. And again, we suggested to Microsoft that they could just get rid of the ability to send this claim at all, right? And have applications shift to using something like user info endpoint, right? So from an OpenID Connect perspective, again, it's like a little more work for app devs, right? But after they get that token, they can also potentially go reach out to another Microsoft common endpoint here that's a user info endpoint where they can ask Enter ID for other data about users, right? So here we can basically call that endpoint, and we can get email addresses. And again, these would be addresses that include unverified domains, right? Because this is post-authentication. There's no concern that the app is, doing something stupid from an auth perspective with that. So I have a lot of this written up in a blog. As I say with all my talks, because I own Entra.ms, it is for sale to Microsoft for enough money. But sl.entra.ms/noauth, and you can go read all about everything here. Right. So key takeaways basically with this. It is extremely dangerous, right? Between Office 365 integrations, the potential for data that's out there, right, in applications. When I was trying to talk with some folks who don't understand all the tech bits, right, I'm just like, think of like a SaaS application that means a lot to you and your organization for whatever you do, right, finance, sales, whatnot. And then just like say, right, if I knew your email address, right, to sound all hackery, right, I could get into that application as you and get access as you to all the data and all the stuff you have in there, right? So whatever you want to do with that stuff as an attacker, it's, I think, an extremely dangerous attack, and it's going to continue to exist, right? Basically, in the MSRC case, when I was talking with Microsoft before these talks, they basically still doubled down on this being a developer problem, right? Developers need to follow the standard, but unfortunately, it's one of those things, right, where they can put out all the guidance in the world. Most developers that are developing applications that are susceptible to this probably aren't out there reading the docs or hearing about the problems here. Right, and again, just as I mentioned earlier, the unfortunate bit is that customer is the one who's really stuck in the middle, right? They have no idea the app is vulnerable unless they go test it themselves, right, which is very time consuming. And there's nothing on the service principle that would let them know that there could be even a potential for problems here. So, any questions?
Interesting talk. Thank you. On the detection, maybe I'm just underestimating the complexity of this attack, but would it be possible to check whether like the UPN and the mail attribute have a mismatch? Because that's sort of like a prerequisite for at least one of the scenarios, right? Or is that? Yeah,
I mean, so yes and no, right? The problem you're going to have is, so if you're talking about from like an Entra perspective, so I'm like a customer, which I didn't have in here, so guests, right? Guests are really the other half of that equation, where I was talking about Microsoft engineering themselves into like a corner. When you take that common endpoint and mix it in with guests, right? So guests will always have a UPN that is different than a mail address. Now I get that you could say, well, we can filter by guest or determine who is a guest, right, and a tenant, but you can't always, well, there might be ways, but I would still be concerned that it's not like bulletproof, but it is a good question there, so, yep.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
The patch operation to put the unverified email onto the account, is that literally just a GraphQL, like the equivalent of a GraphQL kind of like write operation where there's no real authentication or authorization check on the write?
So you do need to have rights, right? But again, if that patch operation is happening in the attacker tenant, right? So figure the attacker has global admin, so there's no, but it's trivial to get an Entra tenant these days. So kind of in the research, I'm putting off like what rights would you need, just because you're probably in GA and whatever tenant. But yeah, you would need still rights to go modify that. And I did find oddly that like if it's a tenant that had like Exchange Online enabled and some other stuff for the mailbox, that it would actually block the ability to change email address. But again, it's easy, just go create a new user and off you go. So, but good question.
Great talk.
Thanks.
Do you have plans to test the other applications, the remaining 1,000 and some change?
Well, I mean, that's the problem, right? And I mean, this is like something that I was noodling on because I actually was going to scrape Defender for Cloud Apps, or whatever it's called now, right? They've got like 30,000 apps in there. But ultimately, the problem that I find is like, you really don't have a way to tell if an app is vulnerable without sort of observing or knowing how the app works, right? Now, in some things, generally you'd get some sort of error. So applications that were following spec, you would tend to get some sort of error if you tried to pull this off, or they would just basically like see you as a different user. But right, in most of our testing, the only way to really know that there was a vulnerability is we'd go into the app, sort of determine what it is, create some sort of data set in it, and then as the right attacker go see if we could observe the same data set. So, and it's something that I'm like, oh, it'd be like a great use case for AI, but I'm like old and don't know AI stuff. So, but no, it is interesting. I'd love to have a way to figure out like what is actually vulnerable. So, good question.
Thank you.
Is this vulnerability, is it specific to Entra, or could this also be happening in other environments similar to this?
Good question. So, I mean, I guess I'm not, the only other IDP I know of, like put to the side like Facebook and stuff, right? At least in my research, it was really focused on enterprise stuff. The only other identity provider I know of is Google, right, that offers this sort of stuff. I don't know anything about Google or how the underlying mechanisms of their, sign with Google stuff works, so I can't really say. But good question. I don't know if there was, do you have? No? Oh.
One question for me.
Yeah.
What else could Microsoft be doing here to kind of help their customers? You had that page with like protecting the customers. Like, what can they actually do here for it?
Well, that's what I think. I mean, again, I wish that there was an attribute on service principles, right? We can see that there's lots of data on service principles that is effectively mirrored from an app registration. Again, I get that right, you could feel like maybe it's right trying to just generate fear or something like that. But I don't see anything wrong with flagging on a service principle that it's asking for an unverified email claim. Customers of the applications, right, can then sort of make their own risk assessment on this. And potentially, like, maybe this is wishful thinking, right, that if we have all little groups of customers who are using these applications and they know this and they go talk to the vendor and, right, sort of like almost like community, right, sort of help to clean this stuff up. Because I really don't think vendors are going to, right, I mean, developers are going to develop and they'll just keep doing this stuff, right, until they know better. So, but, yeah.
All right. Let's give it up for Eric here.
Thank you.